The morning Elias Calloway rode into the town of Dusk Creek with nothing but a worn saddle, an empty coin purse, and a heart heavier than the summer sky. He never once imagined that he would ride out of it having surrendered the finest thing he had ever owned and gained something far greater in return. Dusk Creek sat in the southeastern corner of New Mexico Territory in the year 1878, a place that looked as though the desert had simply grown tired and agreed to stop moving for a while. The buildings were sun-bleached and leaning. The main street was a ribbon of packed red dirt that turned to soup after rain, and the people who lived there wore the particular kind of hardness that comes not from cruelty but from endurance. There was a general store run by a man named Horace Penny, who weighed everything twice and smiled never. There was a saloon called the Copper Spur, which did more business before noon than any decent establishment had a right to. There was a livery stable, a small church with a bell that had cracked sometime in the spring of 1874 and never been replaced, and a jailhouse that the sheriff, a heavy-set man called Dolan, used more for sleeping than for keeping the peace. Elias had been riding for 3 days out of Las Cruces, trailing a herd of sold cattle back through empty country, alone because his partner Roy Meade had taken a fall from a horse 2 months prior and was still recovering his leg in a boarding house in Silver City. He was 26 years old, lean through the middle, broad through the shoulders, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the temples when sweat dampened it, and eyes the color of a late afternoon sky, that specific shade between blue and gray that people sometimes described as silver. He was not a particularly handsome man in the way that saloon portraits were handsome, but there was something steady about his face, something that made strangers feel they could trust him, and something in the set of his jaw that told those same strangers not to test that trust. He rode into Dusk Creek on his horse, Ranger. Ranger was not simply a horse. He was the kind of animal that comes along perhaps once in a man's lifetime, if that man is very fortunate and very patient. He was a 16-hand Appaloosa with a deep chest, a coat the color of fresh cream scattered with copper-brown spots along his hindquarters, and a temperament so even and intelligent that Elias had sometimes caught himself speaking to the horse the way a man might speak to a trusted friend. He had raised Ranger from a colt. He had trained him on the open flats of the Pecos River Basin. He had turned down offers from ranchers who could have given him a year's wage for that animal, and every time he had turned them down with the kind of quiet certainty that made the offering men feel slightly embarrassed for asking. Ranger was not for sale. That was simply the truth of things. Elias tied Ranger outside the Copper Spur and went inside to buy a meal he could actually afford, which meant he asked for whatever was cheapest and sat at the far end of the bar where the light was dim, and the other men would leave him to his own thinking. He was eating beans and a heel of cornbread when the commotion started outside. He heard it before he understood it, a woman's voice, low and sharp, the kind of controlled sound that comes from someone who is very frightened, but has decided that fear is not going to have the loudest say in the matter. Then a man's voice, louder and uglier. Then the sound of boots on the boardwalk, and then the particular kind of silence that falls over a place when people stop what they are doing and lean toward a window. Elias was not the kind of man who looked for trouble. He had a genuine and deeply held preference for minding his own affairs, finishing his food and moving along. But he got up from his stool anyway, because the woman's voice had a quality to it that pulled at something in him, the way a hand on your sleeve pulls at you when you would rather keep walking. What he saw when he stepped onto the boardwalk was this: a man named Gareth Pruitt, whom Elias did not yet know by name but would come to know well enough, had a woman by the wrist in the middle of the street. Pruitt was perhaps 40, thick-necked and prosperous-looking in the way that certain men in the West looked prosperous, not because they had earned it cleanly, but because they had never needed to. He wore a good hat and a silver belt buckle, and an expression that suggested he believed the world to be a collection of objects that existed for his own convenience. The woman he held was not an object. She was maybe 22 or 23, dressed in a plain cotton dress the color of sage, with dark hair that had come partly loose from its pins and was falling across one cheek. She was not crying. That was the first thing Elias noticed. She was standing as straight as a woman can stand when a man has hold of her wrist and is pulling, and her face, what he could see of it from the boardwalk, was set in an expression of controlled fury that Elias found, in the same instant that he registered it, entirely magnificent. "You belong to an agreement made by your father," Prout was saying, loudly enough that the whole street could hear him. "A debt is a debt, Clara, and a man settling a debt with what he has is not a new thing in this world." "I am not a thing my father had," the woman said, and her voice did not shake at all. "The law sees it differently." Prout nodded toward Sheriff Dolan, who was standing at the edge of the scene with his thumbs in his belt loops and a look on his face that was the very picture of a man who had already decided which way he was going to lean and was just waiting for the wind to blow him there. "Sheriff will tell you. Your father's note came due. The arrangements were made. You'll come along now." Elias stepped down from the boardwalk. He did not make a scene of it. He simply moved through the small crowd of watching men and women the way water moves through a gap, and he came to stand perhaps 10 feet from Prout and the woman, and he said quietly, "Let go of her wrist." Prout looked at him. Sheriff Dolan looked at him. The woman looked at him, and her eyes, dark brown, sharp, and currently lit with both relief and a complicated kind of pride that did not want relief to be showing, found his face and held it. "Who in the hell are you?" Prout said. "Nobody," Elias said truthfully, "but I'm asking you to let go of her wrist." "This is a private business matter," Prout said. He had not released her wrist. "There's no kind of private business that requires a man to drag a woman down a public street," Elias said. Prout laughed, and several of the men nearby made sounds that suggested they found this amusing, and the sheriff continued to study the middle distance with professional dedication. The woman was looking at Elias with an expression that had shifted slightly, the fury still there, but something else beneath it now, something that was taking his measure in a way that felt careful and serious. "She's indentured to me through her father's debt," Prout said. He released her wrist with a small, deliberate movement that was worse than the holding, because it was dismissive. He reached into his vest pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, which he held out. "Signed and lawful. 3 years of labor to settle what her father owed. The sheriff can confirm it." Elias looked at the sheriff. The sheriff looked at the ground. "How much?" Elias said. "Pardon me?" "The debt," Elias said. "How much did her father owe you?" Prout's expression changed in a small way that was difficult to name. $60, he said slowly, as though he expected a trick. $60. Elias did not have $60. He had $11 and a few coins. He had a saddle, a bedroll, a rifle, and ranger. He stood in the middle of that red dirt street in Dusk Creek with the sun already fierce at 9 in the morning, and the watching eyes of a town pressing on him from all sides, and he thought about Ranger. He thought about the horse with the specific clarity that comes when a decision has already been made by some part of you, and the rest of you is simply catching up. He thought about the colt he had been, long-legged and uncertain on the flats. He thought about the horse he had become, steady and faithful and irreplaceable. "I'll trade my horse," Elias said, "for the note." The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture to it. Prout looked past Elias to where Ranger stood tied at the rail outside the copper spur, and even from where they stood, the horse was extraordinary, the dappled cream and copper coat catching the morning sun in a way that made him look almost luminous. Prout was a man who understood the value of horses, whatever else might be said about him, and his eyes did the calculation quickly and without effort. "The Appaloosa?" Prout said. "Yes," Elias said. "Elias." The woman said his name and then stopped, and then he realized she did not know his name, that she had simply said a word that sounded like a name, and he turned to look at her, and she was staring at him with an expression he could not fully read, but that undid something in him. "You do not have to do this." "I know," he said simply. Prout took the horse. He took the note that confirmed Clara Beaumont's 3 years of indentured labor, and he handed it to Elias, who handed it to Clara, who took it with both hands and held it as though it might dissolve. Prut untied Ranger from the rail with the practiced movements of a man who knew horses, and Ranger turned his great head and looked at Elias with those dark, intelligent eyes, and Elias looked back at him and said, quietly, "Go on, then," and that was that. Clara Beaumont watched Elias watch his horse be led away, and she saw everything that cost him, every quiet inch of it, and she knew she would never forget that morning for as long as she lived. She was right. Elias stood in the street after Prut had gone, and for a moment he simply stayed very still, the way a man does when he has done something irrevocable, and the weight of it is settling over him. Then he picked up his hat, which he had not realized had fallen into the dust, brushed it against his leg, and put it back on his head. Clara was beside him. She had not moved away. "My name is Clara Beaumont," she said. Her voice was different now, not the controlled fury of before, but something quieter and more careful. "I have to ask you something." "All right," he said. "Why?" He thought about that. He thought about it with the same honesty he tried to bring to most things, and then he said, "I couldn't stand by and watch." It was true. It was also, he suspected, not the complete truth, but it was the part of the truth he had access to at that particular moment. "You gave up your horse," she said. "Yes. For someone you had never met. Yes. That was either the most generous thing I have ever witnessed," she said, "or the most foolish." "Could be both," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but had the same intentions. Something in her face changed then, something small and warm and watchful. "I don't have $60, she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I wasn't expecting any," he said. "I have a house," she said, "such as it is. My father's house on the north side of town. 2 rooms and a kitchen and a garden that's mostly weeds right now. I also have," she paused, "a mule." He looked at her. "Mathilda," she said, with a gravity that told him this mule was a serious matter. "She is old and she is deeply opinionated, but she is sound enough. If you need to ride somewhere, she is yours to use. It is not Ranger, I know it is not Ranger, but it is what I have." "I appreciate that," he said, meaning it. She nodded once, a precise and purposeful nod that suited her. "Are you passing through?" she asked. "I was," he said. He looked down at his boots. He looked up at the empty rail where Ranger had been tied. "I may need to stay a few days, find some work. I'm going to need a horse eventually." "There is work at the Finley Ranch," she said. "North of town about 4 miles. Old Marcus Finley takes seasonal hands for the late summer drives. He is a fair man." "Thank you," Elias said. "Don't thank me," she said quickly, and there was something fierce in it, something that was not unkindness. "You gave up your horse for me. Whatever small useful thing I can offer in return is not charity, it is just decency." He looked at her then, really looked at her in the full morning light, and she looked back at him with the same directness, and neither of them looked away for several seconds, which was long enough to be noticeable. "Clara Beaumont," he said. "Elias," she said, and then she almost smiled, catching herself. "I still don't know your full name." "Calloway, Elias Calloway." "Elias Calloway," she repeated, as though she were writing it somewhere inside herself. "Come to supper tonight if you're staying. It's the least the world owes you." He came to supper. The house was exactly as she had described it, 2 rooms and a kitchen, and it had the particular quality of a place that had known better days and was doing its best not to make a fuss about it. The furniture was solid and old, and everything was very clean, which told him something about Clara Beaumont that he had already suspected. The garden out back was indeed mostly weeds, but he could see the bones of it, the careful rows that someone had planted with intention, and there were a few brave tomato plants holding on through the summer heat. She made a stew with dried beans and a piece of salt pork and some of the tomatoes from the garden, and it was the best meal he had eaten in weeks, and he told her so, and she looked briefly pleased, and then immediately cautious about being pleased, as though pleasure were something she had learned to be careful with. They ate at the small table by the window, and the oil lamp was lit between them, and Mathilda the mule could be heard occasionally from the small lean-to shed out back, making her opinions known to the night in general. Your father, Elias said carefully, when supper was done and they were sitting with their coffee cups. Is he gone? She said. He passed in April. His heart. She said it simply, the way people say things they have already had time to settle with themselves. He was a good man who made a foolish agreement with a bad one. He borrowed money from Prout 3 years ago when the drought took his crops. He thought he could repay it. He couldn't. She looked at the coffee cup. He didn't know what Prout intended to collect when the note came due. That's not a legal indenture, Elias said. I know that, she said. The law in Dust Creek is whatever Dolan decides it is, and Dolan decides whatever Prout tells him to decide. My father had no deed to the land, he was farming rented land, and I have no family here except my father's older brother who lives in Albuquerque and doesn't know about any of this. She paused. Or didn't this morning? What happens now? Elias asked. I have the note, she said. The debt is settled, Prout has no claim, her chin lifted slightly. I intend to find work, I can sew, I can cook. I know enough about keeping accounts from watching my father that I could be of use to a merchant or a hotel. She looked at him steadily. I will be fine, Mr. Calloway. Elias, he said. A beat. Elias, she said. He rode Mathilda out to the Finley ranch the next morning, which was an experience in humility that he felt was probably good for him. Mathilda was a gray mule of at least 15 years, with a gait like a rocking chair that had opinions about direction, and the 4 miles took considerably longer than they should have. But Marcus Finley was indeed a fair man, a weathered 70-year-old with a white mustache and sharp blue eyes, and he hired Elias on for seasonal work at fair wages, mending fences and driving cattle, and doing the 100 unnamed tasks that a working ranch requires. He came back to town at the end of his first workday to find that Clara had already secured herself a position. She had gone to the hotel, a modest 2-story building called the Desert Rose, and offered her services to the proprietress, a practical woman named May Stroud, who had immediately recognized competence when she saw it and had hired Clara to help with the accounts, the laundry scheduling, and the mending of linens. The wage was not generous, but it was honest. Elias learned all of this standing at the door of the Beaumont house when he came to return Mathilda to her shed, and Clara told him while leaning against the doorframe with her arms crossed and her chin at that particular angle that he was beginning to recognize as her characteristic expression of determined self-sufficiency. You look pleased, he said. I am pleased, she said. I like being useful. May I? He stopped. She waited. Would you like company this evening? I just mean that I ate alone at the saloon last night after supper and the conversation was poor. She regarded him for a moment with those dark eyes that always seemed to be evaluating something more than just what you said. I was going to read, she said. I can be quiet, he offered. She considered this. There's coffee, she said. I'll take it, he said. That was how the evenings began. He would come back from the Finley ranch in the long summer light, return Mathilda to her shed, knock at the door of the small house, and Clara would let him in. Sometimes she was reading. Sometimes she was sewing, taking in small mending jobs that she had begun to pick up from women in town. Sometimes she was writing letters to her uncle in Albuquerque. He would sit in the other chair by the window and drink his coffee, and they would talk, or they would not talk, and both things were equally comfortable in a way that surprised him, because he was not a man who had found easy company in silence with very many people. She was sharp. That was the first thing he would have said about her, if someone had asked. Her mind moved quickly, and with a kind of precision that caught him off guard more than once in those early evenings, because he would say something he thought was settled, and she would turn it slightly, and he would see a side of it he had not considered. She had read more than most women he had known, more than most anyone, really, and she had opinions about the things she read that she stated plainly and defended with a kind of quiet stubbornness that he found both exasperating and wonderful. She was also funny, which he had not expected. Not in a broad or showy way, but in a dry, precise way that snuck up on you. She made a comment one evening about Mathilda's behavior that made Elias laugh harder than he had laughed in months, and afterward the room had a different quality to it, warmer and less careful. "You have a good laugh," she said, and then seemed startled that she had said it and looked at her book. He felt the warmth of it all the way through him. He did not say anything right then, because he was learning that Clara Beaumont set the pace of things, and that this was right and proper given all that she had been through, and that the best thing he could do was to be steady and honest and not push. But he sat with it all the way home being the boarding house on the south end of town, where he paid 50 cents a week for a narrow bed and a washstand, and it kept him in good company through the night. 3 weeks passed in this way. The summer moved as it does in the New Mexico territory, which is to say with a kind of blazing relentlessness that makes the evenings, when the heat finally releases its grip, feel like a gift. Elias worked at the Finley Ranch with the conscientious reliability that made Marcus Finley nod to himself, and think that this young man was the right kind. Clara worked at the Desert Rose and was already trusted by May Stroud with tasks that May would not ordinarily have handed to someone new. The town of Dust Creek watched both of them with the specific interest that small towns reserve for things that are developing in plain sight, but have not yet declared themselves. Gareth Prout was still in town. This was the fact that sat beneath everything else like a stone in a boot. He still had Ranger Elias could see the Appaloosa occasionally, tied outside Prout's land office on the main street, and he still had his arrangement with Sheriff Dolan, and he had not forgiven Elias for the public scene in the street. He had not done anything yet, which was almost worse, because men like Prout did not forget and did not let things go. They simply waited for the angle that suited them. Elias was aware of this. He was careful without being fearful, which is a particular discipline. Clara was aware of it too. She mentioned it one evening without preamble in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. "Prout watches me when I walk past his office," she said. "I know," Elias said. "He's not going to do anything directly," she said. "He's the kind of man who works through other people." "I know that too." "Are you worried?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. "I'm watchful," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him across the lamp. "You're a very particular kind of man, Elias Calloway," she said. "Is that good?" he asked. She was quiet for just a moment too long, which was its own kind of answer. It was on a Saturday in mid-August that things shifted between them in a way that could not be shifted back. Elias had ridden Mathilda into town early to do his Saturday errands, flour and salt from Penny's store, a new pair of work gloves from the dry goods, a letter he had been meaning to post to Roy Mead in Silver City. He had almost finished his errands when he saw Clara at the far end of the main street, standing outside Penny's with a basket over her arm, talking to a man he did not recognize. The man was perhaps 30, well-dressed for Dust Creek, and he was standing slightly too close to Clara and gesturing as he spoke with a familiarity that made Elias' jaw tighten before he had made any conscious decision to feel anything. He told himself to mind his business. He posted his letter. He bought his gloves. He turned Mathilda back toward the main street. Clara was still there, but the quality of the scene had changed. The man was now blocking her path with a casual deliberateness that was clearly intentional, and Clara's posture had shifted to that careful, controlled set that Elias recognized from the very first morning. He got down from Mathilda and walked over. "Morning," he said, addressing Clara directly. "Ready to go?" The man looked at him. Clara looked at him, and something in her eyes was both relieved and annoyed, and she sorted through those two things in roughly half a second and landed on composed. "Ready," she said, and stepped to his side. The man watched them go with an expression that Elias did not look back to confirm. They walked in silence for half a block, and then Clara said, "I didn't need saving." "I know," Elias said. "You walked over anyway." "I did." Another half block. "Who was he?" Elias asked. "He works for Prout," she said. "Land surveyor. He was suggesting that I might find life more comfortable if I came to some kind of arrangement with Mr. Prout regarding the house." "What kind of arrangement?" The kind that involves Mr. Prout owning the house and me being grateful for the privilege of living in it." Elias stopped walking. Clara stopped beside him. They were standing outside the church with the cracked bell, in the thin shade of an old cottonwood, and the morning was already hot. "He doesn't own that house," Elias said. "No," Clara said. "He doesn't, but he is positioning himself to make a claim, I think. I need to talk to a lawyer. There's one in Las Cruces." She looked at her basket. "I can't afford the trip right now." "I can," Elias said. He had been working for 3 weeks at fair wages, and he had been careful with his money because he was always careful with money. "I've got enough put by. We could take Mathilda and the wagon and be there in a day and a half." She looked at him with those careful eyes. She said. "You shouldn't go alone," he said. "Not with Prout having people watching you." She was quiet for a long moment. The cottonwood moved above them in a small breath of wind. "All right," she said, "but I'm going to pay you back for the lawyer's fee and for your time." "You don't have to." "Yes," she said firmly, "I do. That's the only way I can accept it." "All right," he said. "Thank you, Elias," she said, and the way she said his name with that particular quiet emphasis did something to the middle of his chest. They left for Las Cruces 2 days later, on a Monday morning, in the small wagon that had belonged to Clara's father. Mathilda pulled it with characteristic stubbornness for the first mile, and then settled into a grudging compliance. They took the main road south through the desert, which was long and flat and baking, with the Organ Mountains rising to the east in a wall of gray-violet rock. There was a particular quality to traveling together that is different from all other kinds of company, Elias thought. You are close enough together for hours and hours, with nowhere to go and nothing to do but talk or not talk, and the landscape moves past slowly enough that you have time to look at things together and notice the same things, and point them out to each other. And this creates a specific kind of intimacy that is quiet and unforced and very real. They talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are comfortable. She told him about her childhood, about growing up in southern Texas, in a small town outside San Antonio, about her father who had been a farmer with a gift for telling stories and a weakness for trusting the wrong people, about her mother who had died of a fever when Clara was 12, and whose absence was the central fact of her growing up. He told her about his own childhood, a ranch in eastern Texas, a father who was not unkind but who communicated primarily through work rather than words, a mother who had taught him to read and who had died when he was 19, a brother named Daniel who now ranched near Fort Worth with a wife and 3 children. He told her about Ranger, how he had found the colt abandoned in a dry riverbed, barely 3 weeks old, and had raised him on bucket milk and patience. She listened to this with the focused attention she brought to everything, and when he finished she said quietly, "That's why it cost you so much." "Yes," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I mean that simply and completely. I'm sorry you had to make that choice." "I'm not," he said, and he realized as he said it that it was perfectly true. She looked at him sidelong, and the morning light was on her face, and she did not look away, and he did not look away, and Mathilda made a sound of deep personal grievance about a rut in the road, and they both looked forward again, and Clara laughed, and he laughed too, and after that the air between them was different in a way that was very good. They stopped at midday in the shade of a mesquite stand and ate the food Clara had packed: cornbread and dried venison and early apples from somewhere. He didn't know where she'd found apples in August, but they were good, and drank water from the canteen, and Mathilda cropped dried grass with philosophical contentment. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Of course," he said. "Why are you still here?" She looked at him directly, not accusingly, just honestly. "You could have left Dust Creek the day after you gave up your horse. You could have found work anywhere, earned enough for another horse, moved on. You're a man who can find his way in the world. Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment, turning an apple core in his hands. "I told myself it was because I needed to earn a horse," he said, "and that's true in part. But," she said, "but it's also true that there's a reason I'm sitting here instead of anywhere else, and I think we both know what it is," he said, and he looked at her steadily when he said it because she deserved his honesty even when honesty was a vulnerable thing. She held his gaze. Something in her face was doing what he had come to think of as its private reckoning, the careful, internal assessment that she brought to important things. "I am not easy," she said at last. "I want you to know that clearly. I have not had an easy time of things, and it has made me careful and sometimes too proud and not always willing to let people in." "I know," he said. "You know from 3 weeks of evenings and coffee," she said. "I know from watching you face Gareth Prude in the middle of the street without a single tear," he said. "And I know from the way you talk about your father, and from how you arranged your own employment the day after your entire situation changed, and from the way you eat an apple." He paused. "You take exactly 4 bites. It's very precise." She stared at him. And then she laughed, a real full laugh surprised out of her, and she covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. And when she lowered her hand, she was still smiling, really smiling, the first time he had seen her smile like that, and he would think about it for a long time afterward. It was like watching something that had been very carefully closed open all at once in the sun. "You noticed that," she said. "I notice things about you," he said simply. She looked at Mathilda for a moment. She looked at the mountains. She looked at her hands. "I notice things about you too," she said quietly, and it was the most important sentence she had said to him. They arrived in Las Cruces that evening and found respectable lodging separate rooms at a boarding house near the main plaza, and the next morning they went to see the lawyer, a careful man named Henry Voss who had a tidy office full of leather-bound volumes. Clara presented her situation plainly, and Henry Voss listened and asked precise questions, and then delivered his verdict with professional directness. The arrangement Prude had made with Clara's father was, under any proper reading of New Mexico territorial law, a private debt, not an indenture, and Prude had no legal standing to claim either Clara's labor or the house her father had occupied. The house, being rented land, would revert to the landowner, a rancher named Aldous Webb who lived outside Las Cruces, but Clara had a right to remain there until the rental agreement formally expired at the end of the year. "That gives you 4 months, Voss said. "Then I'll use them," Clara said. Voss drew up a formal letter attesting to these facts, with his seal, which could be presented to any law officer who tried to act on Prude's behalf. It cost $2.40, which Clara paid from her own wage money, with a finality that told Elias she had been planning this. They were back on the main street of Las Cruces by mid-morning, and the day was before them, and Las Cruces was considerably larger than Dusk Creek, with a proper plaza and shade trees and a Mexican cantina that was already serving food, and Elias looked at Clara and she looked at him. "Dinner," he said. "We have the time." "We have the time," she agreed. They ate at the cantina, chili verde and fresh tortillas and coffee that was better than anything Dusk Creek had to offer. And the afternoon light came through the open doors in long, dusty slants, and they talked for 2 hours without once running out of things to say. She told him about a novel she had read 3 times, the way she felt about the landscape, the specific beauty of desert country that people from greener places sometimes missed, and about the future she was tentatively beginning to build in her mind, something different from before, something with more ground under it. He told her about the future he sometimes thought about, a ranch of his own someday, nothing grand, just enough to be genuinely his, with good horses and a small orchard, because his mother had kept an orchard and he had never stopped thinking that an orchard was a worthwhile thing. "An orchard," she said. "Peach trees mostly," he said. "Maybe some apple." She was quiet for a moment, something turning in her eyes. "My mother had an herb garden," she said. She was very serious about it. She said a house without an herb garden was just a building. "She sounds like she was right," he said. "She usually was," Clara said and smiled at the memory. They rode back toward Dusk Creek the next morning in a different atmosphere than they had left in. Something between them was settled now, even though nothing had been formally said, and the desert road was the same, and Mathilda was the same, and the sun was just as pitiless. But everything had a different quality. She sat closer to him on the wagon bench. Not dramatically so, but measurably. And when the wagon hit a rough patch and she put her hand out to steady herself and her hand landed on his arm, she left it there for a moment before drawing it back, and he was very aware of that moment, and so was she. They arrived back in Dusk Creek in the late afternoon of the second day, and Elias unhitched Mathilda and settled her in the shed, and Clara went inside to light the lamp, and he followed her to the door and stood on the small porch. "Thank you," she said from the doorway, the lamp lit behind her and the evening just starting to come blue across the desert. "I would do it again," he said. She looked at him. The moment held. He was very aware of everything: the lamp, the cooling air, the cracked bell on the church 2 streets over, the sound of Mathilda settling in the shed, the particular dark brown of her eyes in the evening light. "Elias," she said, and stopped. "Yes," he said. I think she stopped again. She was not a woman who stumbled over words, and the stumbling now meant something. "I think that I am glad you rode into Dusk Creek," she said finally, "even with everything it cost you." "So am I," he said. "Clara." He said her name the way you say something you have been wanting to say for a while, and she heard it, and a slow, certain warmth moved across her face, and she said, "Good night, Elias Calloway," in a voice that was low and private and was not a goodbye at all. He walked back to his boarding house through the warm dark, and he felt something in him that he recognized after a moment's searching as happiness. Real, unqualified happiness, the kind that does not need anything added to it. A week later, Prout made his move. It was not dramatic. Men like Prout rarely were in the direct sense. What happened was this. Elias arrived at the Finley ranch to find Marcus Finley waiting for him at the gate with an expression that was simultaneously apologetic and furious. "I've had a man come from the bank in Las Cruces," Marcus said. "Prout's called in a loan I took 8 years ago. I thought it was settled. It wasn't apparently. There are legal proceedings." He paused, his white mustache working. "I have to let my seasonal hands go, Elias. I'm sorry. It's not your work. Your work is the best I've had. It's Prout, and I can't prove it, but I know it's Prout." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said. "Thank you for the work, Mr. Finley." He rode Mathilda back to town with the calm deliberateness of a man who is thinking very carefully. He went to the Copper Spur, not for a drink but to sit and think in the relative cool of the interior, and he had been there perhaps 20 minutes when 2 of Prout's men came in and sat at the bar, and began talking loudly about how certain drifters who interfered in other people's business had a way of finding trouble. It was aimed at him. It was meant to be aimed at him. He finished his coffee. He never drank whiskey before noon and rarely after, and he left without looking at them. He went to Clara. She opened the door to his knock and took one look at his face and said, "Come in." He told her what had happened, the job, Finley's bank trouble, the men in the saloon. She listened without interrupting, standing with her arms crossed and her face doing its private reckoning. When he finished, she said, "He's going to keep doing this. He won't stop because he doesn't know how to lose." "No," Elias agreed. "Then we have to do something that makes continuing cost him more than stopping," she said. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "Aldous Webb," she said. "The man who owns the land this house sits on. He lives outside Las Cruces. He is, by all accounts, a well-regarded man with no love for Gareth Prout. I've heard his name mentioned in connection with a cattle dispute Prout was involved in 3 years ago." She looked at him steadily. "If I could get word to Webb about what Prout has been doing, and if Webb has his own grudge against Prout, then Webb might be willing to help. He has money and legal standing. He knows people in the territorial government." "That's a long chain," Elias said. "Yes," she said, "but it's the right one." They wrote a letter to Aldous Webb that evening, Clara drafting it and Elias reading it over and offering occasional thoughts, the oil lamp between them again and the night quiet outside. The letter was precise and factual and careful, laying out what Prout had done to Clara, what he had done to Elias, what was currently being done to Marcus Finley, and making the argument plainly that Pruett's operations in Dusk Creek constituted a pattern of coercion that had gone unaddressed because of his arrangement with Sheriff Dolan. They sent it with the morning stage to Las Cruces. Then they waited. In the meantime, Elias found other work. There was not much in Dusk Creek itself, but he was resourceful and willing. He repaired a section of fence for the widow Hartley on the South Road. He helped Horace Pinney move a delivery of goods from the stage depot to the back storeroom. He took a 3-day job breaking a pair of horses for a rancher named Cordell, who paid him in cash and an old but serviceable saddle. It was not the Finley Ranch wages, but it was enough to keep him fed and housed. He told himself that the practical thing, the rational thing, would be to move on. Dusk Creek was small, and Pruitt was making it smaller for him by the day. He had no particular tie here beyond Clara Beaumont, and Clara Beaumont was a grown woman with her own lawyer's letter and her own job and her own mule, and she had made it very clear that she did not need anyone to save her. He stayed anyway. He stayed because the evenings at her small table had become the thing he looked forward to most in his days. He stayed because he had started to notice the way she moved through the world with that quiet, purposeful precision, with the occasional, surprising warmth that she gave only when she trusted, and he could not imagine going somewhere where he would not see it. He stayed because one evening she had reached across the table and put her hand over his when he was talking about Ranger, and he could hear the loss in his own voice, and she had just put her hand there and not said anything because she understood that some things do not need words, and that had undone him in a way that nothing else ever quite had. He was deeply, irreversibly in love with Clara Beaumont. He knew it the way you know the things that are simply true, not with drama or surprise, but with the quiet recognition of something that has been true for a while and is only now being acknowledged in full daylight. He had not told her yet. He was waiting for the right moment, and also, if he was being honest, he was waiting because there was a particular terror to it that had nothing to do with cowardice and everything to do with how much it mattered. Aldous Webb's reply came on a Friday, 3 weeks after they had sent the letter. It arrived on the stage and Clara brought it to him at the boarding house, and they opened it together at the small table by the window, and it was better than either of them had hoped. Webb was indeed a man with a history where Pruitt was concerned. He had lost a land contract 3 years ago to Pruitt through what he described in his letter as methods that a court of law would have found irregular if anyone had thought to bring them before a court of law. He had been waiting for an occasion. He had connections in Santa Fe. He had already, upon receiving their letter, dispatched a communication to the territorial governor's office in Santa Fe regarding the conduct of Sheriff Dolan, and was prepared to travel to Dusk Creek personally in the following month to speak to a federal land officer who had apparently been making inquiries of his own into Pruitt's operations. "He's coming," Clara said, looking up from the letter. "He's coming," Elias confirmed. The next thing she did was something he did not expect. She exhaled, a long, slow exhale that he understood was the release of something she had been holding for a very long time, and she put the letter down on the table, and she leaned forward and she rested her forehead in her hands for just a moment. Her shoulders came down by a 1/4 inch. The particular set she maintained so carefully relaxed in a way that was not weakness but release, and he saw it for what it was. A woman who had been holding up an enormous thing for a very long time, allowing herself, for just a moment, to set it down. He moved from his chair and crouched beside her chair, and he said very quietly, "Hey." She lifted her head. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. Clara Beaumont was not going to cry in front of him on a Friday afternoon in a boarding house, but she was very close, and her being very close to it made something in him ache with tenderness. "It's going to be all right," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I actually know that now." They were very close together. He was crouching beside her chair, and she had turned toward him, and the distance between them was very small. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said, and it was not an answer to anything he had said yet, but it was an answer to something. "I have to tell you something." "I know what you're going to say," she said. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "And I want you to say it anyway because you deserve to say it and I deserve to hear it." He looked at her, close enough to see the precise shade of brown in her eyes, the faint line that appeared between her brows when she was thinking hard, the curve of her mouth that was already moving toward a smile. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you since somewhere around the third evening with coffee, and probably before that if I'm honest. I'm not a man who says things I don't mean, and I mean this completely." She held his gaze for a moment that felt very long and very full. "I know," she said. "I have been trying very hard not to love you back," she added, "because it seemed ill-advised given everything and because I am not accustomed to things working out." And she said, "I have completely failed." Her mouth curved all the way into that full, open smile, the one he had first seen beside the road to Las Cruces. "I love you, Elias Calloway. You ridiculous, generous, stubbornly present man." He took her face in his hands, both hands, careful and certain, and she leaned into them and he kissed her. And it was a long, quiet, complete kiss that had nothing uncertain in it. And when they came apart, they were both breathing a little differently, and her hand was on the front of his shirt, and he was grinning in a way he could not have stopped if he'd tried. "Ridiculous," he said. "Absolutely ridiculous," she confirmed. And she was still smiling, and he thought he could spend a very long time looking at her smiling. The next weeks had a quality to them that Elias would remember later as golden, not just in the literal sense, though late August in New Mexico territory does have a golden light, but in some internal sense, the sense of a time when things are simply good. He still rode out to whatever work he could find. She still worked at the Desert Rose and took in her mending. The threat of Prout was still present, though both of them felt the balance shifting. But all of that existed inside a wider warmth that made everything else more manageable. He kissed her at the door of the small house every evening when he left. He brought her wildflowers he found along the Finley Road, not in a grand way, just tucked into his coat pocket, and produced with a lack of ceremony that she seemed to appreciate more than ceremony would have earned. She made him a new work shirt from cloth she had saved, measuring him with a tape and a pencil and a focused expression that made him feel very seen. And when she gave it to him, she looked at the floor with a brief, private flush that undid him completely. They talked about the future in the way that two people talk about it when the future has become a shared consideration. It was careful at first, conditional, full of perhaps and someday, and then gradually more direct, as they both became more comfortable with the weight of what they wanted. He wanted the ranch. He had told her that. He had been saving since he was 18, and even with the loss of the various opportunities that Prout had cost him, he had a sum in a bank in El Paso that was not enough yet but was growing toward enough. A few more years of steady work. Maybe sooner, if a good deal presented itself. She wanted the herb garden. She said it lightly, almost as a joke, but he heard underneath it the serious thing. She wanted a home that was genuinely hers, with ground under it that would not be taken away, and walls that would stand through the seasons, and a kitchen where she could put down roots in the most literal possible sense. "Peach trees and herb gardens," he said one evening. "Is that a proposal?" She said, in a tone of elaborate innocence that told him she was fully aware that it was not quite a proposal but was very close to one. "Not yet," he said honestly. "I want to do it properly." "What does properly mean to you?" she asked. "It means I ask you when I have more to offer than a mule and a boarding house room," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was affectionate and exasperated in equal parts. "Elias Calloway," she said, "you gave up the finest horse you ever owned for a stranger. That is more than most men offer in a lifetime." He did not have an answer to that, so he did what seemed right, which was to take her hand across the table and hold it, and she let him, and they sat that way for a long time. Aldous Webb arrived in Dusk Creek on a Wednesday in late September, driving a fine buggy and accompanied by a federal land officer named Chambers and a young lawyer from Santa Fe, whose name nobody caught the first time, and who had to repeat it twice. Webb was a tall man in his 60s with a white beard, and the bearing of someone who had been right about important things long enough that he no longer needed to announce it. He met with Clara first, reviewing her situation with the thoroughness that his letter had promised. Then he met with Marcus Finley, who came in from the ranch with his white mustache set at an angle that suggested he had been waiting a long time for this particular morning. Then the federal officer Chambers spoke with Sheriff Dolan in a meeting that lasted 45 minutes, and from which Dolan emerged looking as though he had been rinsed of something. Gareth Prout was not arrested. The law in 1878 was slower than justice and often moved in different directions, and the federal officer could do only what the law allowed him to do, which was investigate and report and file. But what happened was clear enough in its effects. Within 3 days, Prout's operations in Dusk Creek came under the kind of official scrutiny that men like Prout cannot survive. He had land contracts drawn up under questionable circumstances. He had arrangements with Dolan that were not defensible. He had borrowed money from banks in Las Cruces against collateral that did not fully exist in the way he had represented. He left Dusk Creek on a Sunday morning in early October. He loaded his household onto a wagon and he went, and nobody who watched him go felt anything except the kind of relief that comes with the end of something that had been pressing on you for too long. He took most of his assets with him, including several horses. He did not take Ranger. The Appaloosa had been sold. Prout had sold him 2 weeks after taking him to a ranching family north of the territory. Elias found this out from a man who had heard it from the ranching family's foreman at a trading post east of town. He took the information with the quiet steadiness he brought to most things, and he did not say much about it, but Clara saw his face when he learned it, and she tucked that knowledge away in the same place she kept everything important about this man. Aldous Webb, before he left Dusk Creek, had a conversation with Elias that Elias had not entirely expected. Webb had made his own inquiries about Elias Calloway in the week he'd been in town, in the way that men like Webb make inquiries, quietly and thoroughly. And he had been told by Marcus Finley, by May Stroud, by Horace Pinney, who was not given to generosity with his assessments of people, and by no fewer than 3 other Dusk Creek residents that Elias Calloway was honest, capable, and trustworthy. "I have a piece of land north of Las Cruces," Webb said, in the meeting which took place at the Copper Spur over coffee that was somewhat better than it had been before Prout's departure, because Prout had apparently also owned the contract on the coffee supply, which he had used to keep the quality low. 40 acres, good grassland and some trees along the west end. I've been meaning to do something with it for 3 years and I haven't. I'm going to make you an offer, Calloway. The offer was this. Elias could manage and develop the land over 2 years, improving it, running cattle on it if he could source them, building it into a working property. At the end of 2 years, he could buy it at the current land price, which was fair, and Webb would hold a low-interest note until it was paid. If at any time in those 2 years the arrangement was not working for either party, it could be dissolved without penalty. "Why me?" Elias asked. Webb looked at him with the calm of a man who has been in the business of judging character for a long time. "Because you gave up the finest horse I've ever seen in this territory for a woman's freedom, and you didn't ask for anything in return," he said. "A man who does that is a man I trust with my land." Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to talk to Clara Beaumont." "I assumed you would," Webb said, and something around his eyes suggested he found this exactly right. He went to Clara that evening. She was in the garden behind the house, which she had been attacking with determined practicality for the past 2 weeks, clearing the weeds and turning the soil and making plans. She was wearing an old work dress and her hair was pinned up somewhat haphazardly, and she had a smudge of dirt on her left cheek, and she was crouching over a row she had just cleared, assessing it with a focused expression. And when she heard him come through the gate she looked up and smiled, and he thought again, in that full and certain way he had grown accustomed to thinking it, that he loved her completely and without reservation. He told her about Webb's offer. She listened, crouching there in the turned earth, with the October evening cooling around them and Mathilda audible from the shed in her ongoing commentary on existence. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "North of Las Cruces," she said. "Yes." "That's not Dust Creek," she said. "No," he said, "it's better than Dust Creek. It would mean starting over," she said. "Again." "Yes," he said, "but starting over with 40 acres and a plan is different from starting over with nothing." She looked at the turned earth. She looked at the tomato plants that were finishing for the season. She looked at him. "I want to see it," she said. "Before anything else, I want to see the land." "We can ride out there next week," he said. She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Elias." "Yes. Ask me properly," she said. "Please." He looked at her, the evening light on her face, the dirt on her cheek, the certainty in her eyes. He went down on one knee in the garden in the turned dirt, among the weeds she had been clearing, under the New Mexico sky going orange and violet above them, and he said, "Clara Beaumont, I have nothing except my word and my work and the fact that I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment, and her face did its full private reckoning, and then she said, "Yes. Obviously, yes. Get up out of the dirt." He stood up, grinning, and she stood up with him, and he pulled her close and she put her face against his neck, and he felt her breath and her warmth and the slight shake of her shoulders that was not crying but was adjacent to it. "I love you," she said, against his neck. "I love you," he said, against her hair. Mathilda made a sound of deep and meaningful displeasure from the shed, which they both chose to interpret as congratulations. They were married in the church with the cracked bell on the second Saturday of November, 1878, in a ceremony that was short and direct and completely fitting for both of them. The Reverend was a small, enthusiastic man named Porter who had been hoping someone would give him a reason to ring the cracked bell for months, and he rang it with such vigor that it cracked slightly further, which everyone agreed was fine. May Stroud came from the hotel with a cake she had baked herself. Marcus Finley came from the ranch and shook Elias' hand for so long that it started to be funny. Horace Penny came and looked slightly less grim than usual, which counted as festive. Clara wore her best dress, which was blue wool and very fine, and she had done something to her hair that involved careful pins and a small sprig of dried lavender. And she looked at Elias when she came up the aisle with such direct and total certainty that his throat closed entirely for a moment, and he had to clear it before the Reverend asked for the vows. He had the ring, a simple gold band that he had ordered from a jeweler in Las Cruces through the mail, using the last of his savings from before all of this had started, and it had arrived 3 days before the wedding, and he had kept it in his vest pocket where it grew warm, and was the best company he had ever had in a vest pocket. They rode to Las Cruces for 2 days after the wedding, because it was the right thing to do, and because it was where all of this had taken its important turn, and May Stroud had arranged for them to stay at the hotel there, which was considerably finer than anything in Dust Creek, with a proper window overlooking the plaza and clean cotton sheets, and a supper brought up that was very good indeed. On the second morning they lay in the hotel bed with the morning light coming across the plaza and through the window, and Clara was propped on her elbow looking at him, and he was looking up at her, and she said, "I have been thinking about the herb garden." "Tell me," he said. "I want rosemary first," she said, "because it's hardy and it smells like something that belongs, and then sage, and lavender along the south fence if there is a south fence." "There will be a south fence," he said, "and a kitchen garden proper," she said. "Tomatoes and beans and whatever grows best in that soil. We'll have to learn the soil." "We will," he said. She looked at him with a soft expression that had no guard in it at all. "You're going to be very good at this," she said. "At farming," he said. "At all of it," she said. "At the land and the life," and she paused. "All of it." He reached up and took her hand. "So are you," he said. "You already are." They rode out to see Aldous Webb's land before they rode back to Dust Creek to pack everything they owned, which did not take long because neither of them owned very much. The land was exactly what Webb had described, and more a broad 40 acres of high grassland with the Organ Mountains visible to the east, and a line of cottonwood trees along the western edge where a small seasonal creek ran, and the air was clean and sharp, and the sky was enormous. There was a small adobe structure on the property that had been a line rider's shelter and would need work to become a proper house, but its bones were sound and its walls were thick. Clara stood in the middle of the land and turned around slowly, looking at all of it, and Elias stood beside her and did the same, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes," he said. They went back to Dust Creek and packed their things in 2 days. Elias sold the boarding house room back to its landlord. Clara closed her account at the Desert Rose and said goodbye to May Stroud, who hugged her with a businesslike firmness that was full of real feeling. Mathilda was loaded into the wagon, with considerable editorial commentary on Mathilda's part. They drove out of Dust Creek on a Thursday morning in mid-November, and the town was behind them and the land was ahead of them and the mountains were on the horizon and the sky was clear and everything was fully and properly beginning. The first year on the Webland was hard work and good living, which is not a contradiction. They fixed the adobe house together through the late fall and early winter, Elias doing the heavier structural work, Clara doing the finishing and the interior, both of them doing whatever needed doing because neither of them drew a distinction between work that was proper for one person versus another, when there was simply work that needed doing. By December, the house had a sound roof and a working fireplace and a proper door, and Clara had a kitchen that she organized with the precision she brought to everything, and there was an oil lamp on the table and a rug from a trading post on the packed earth floor, and it was, Elias thought every night when he came in from the cold and saw the lamp lit, the finest place he had ever been. He sourced a small herd of cattle through Marcus Finley's connections, 12 head to start, a manageable number on 40 acres. He built the south fence and the north fence and the east fence, and Clara planted her herb garden along the south fence in the spring exactly as she had planned: rosemary first, then sage, then lavender, and she knelt in the warm March earth and pressed each seedling in with the focused attention she gave everything, and he watched her from the fence line and felt a fullness in his chest that was simply beyond measuring. He got a horse in March. Not Ranger, there would never be another Ranger, but a fine sorrel gelding he bought from a man at the trading post for a fair price, a horse with a good temperament and steady feet, and he named him Cedar after the trees in the creek bottom. He rode Cedar out to check the fence lines and count the cattle every morning, and Cedar was good company, and the land in the early morning light was extraordinary, and his life had the quality of a thing that is exactly right. Clara was with child by April, which they discovered carefully and celebrated quietly and held between them with a kind of reverent gratitude. She continued to work. She was not the kind of woman who stopped working because she was expecting, and the herb garden needed tending and the accounts needed keeping, and there were always things. But he watched her differently now, with an added layer of attentiveness that she accepted with grace and occasionally, gently, told him not to overdo. "I am not made of glass," she said one morning when he reached to take something from her that she was perfectly capable of carrying. "I know," he said. "Then let me carry it," she said. "Can I at least walk beside you?" he asked. She considered this. "Yes," she said, "that's acceptable." He walked beside her. The baby was born in November of 1879, which made Clara 24 and Elias 27, and it was a boy they named James Thomas Calloway, after Clara's father, whose first name had been Thomas, and Elias' grandfather, who had been James. He was a sound, serious baby with his mother's dark hair, and everyone agreed his father's eyes, though babies' eyes are uncertain things for a while and nobody can really say. What was certain was that he was healthy and whole, and that Clara held him in the firelight on the first night and looked down at him with an expression so complete and private that Elias looked away for a moment. because it felt like witnessing something sacred. They wrote to Elias' brother Daniel in Fort Worth with the news, and Daniel wrote back with a warmth and length that surprised Elias, who had not been entirely sure what his brother would make of a marriage entered into so quickly and under such circumstances. Daniel made quite a lot of it. It turned out all of it good. Clara wrote to her uncle in Albuquerque, who had been kept informed of events throughout the previous year, and who had corresponded with her with a regularity and concern that was repairing a relationship that the distance and the difficult years had strained. He sent a gift for the baby, a carved wooden horse, beautifully made from a craftsman in Albuquerque, which Elias set on the shelf above the fireplace. The carved wooden horse stayed on that shelf for years. By the time James was old enough to reach it and try to put it in his mouth, which was his primary interest in objects during his second year of life, there was already a little sister coming, Ellen Frances Calloway, who arrived in the summer of 1882 with her father's lighter coloring and her mother's precise, assessing expression, installed from her very first weeks of life, which made everyone who met her feel they were being evaluated. By then the land was beginning to pay. The cattle herd had grown to 35 head. Elias had paid the first 2 installments on the purchase price to Aldous Webb, who drove out from Las Cruces twice a year to review the progress, and always stayed for supper, and left with a look of deep satisfaction on his face, because there is nothing a man who loves land likes better than to see good land in good hands. The herb garden had become a proper kitchen garden, and then some, with Clara's careful management, and she was trading surplus with a Mexican family 3 miles east, and selling dried herbs to a general store in Las Cruces that a woman named Rodriguez ran, who had recognized quality and paid for it. The house had grown too, not dramatically but carefully, a second room added off the back for the children, and a proper porch along the south side, where in the evenings Elias would sit in a wooden chair, and Clara would sit in the other wooden chair, and they would watch the light leave the mountains and the stars come on over the desert. It was on one of these evenings, with James inside asleep and Ellen nursed and settled and the night coming soft and warm as only a high desert summer night can be, that Clara said very quietly, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "I think about that morning," she said. "The morning in Dusk Creek." He looked at her. The mountains were dark shapes against the last light. "I have thought about it many times," she said. "Many more times than I have ever said, not always consciously, but it comes back. The way you stepped down off that boardwalk, the way you said let go of her wrist, as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing in the world to say." He was quiet, listening. "And then you gave him Ranger," she said. "You gave up the finest horse you had ever owned for someone you did not know. You did it without hesitation. You didn't bargain or calculate or look for another way. You just—" She stopped for a moment. "You just did it. You were worth it," he said simply. "I didn't know that yet," she said. "I didn't know anything about you except that you had walked into a scene that was not your concern and made it yours. That was the thing, you made it yours." "I could not," he said. "I know that now," she said. But then she shook her head. "I had come to believe that men chose the comfortable thing, the convenient thing, the thing that asked the least of them, and there you were, handing over your horse to a stranger before 9 in the morning." He looked at her. The first stars were coming out. "What did you think?" he asked. "In that moment, when I said I'd trade Ranger." She was quiet for a moment, remembering. "I thought you were going to get taken advantage of," she said. "I thought, this man is either the most good-hearted fool I have ever seen, or he is something I have no category for." "Which was it?" he said. "Both," she said. "Definitively both." But she was smiling when she said it, turned toward him in her chair with the stars coming on behind her, and he reached over and took her hand and she turned it to hold his. "I never forgot it," she said. "Not for a single day. Not even when things were hard. Not even in the first year out here when the roof leaked and the cattle got into the creek bottom, and Mathilda sat down in the middle of the road for 40 minutes for reasons she declined to share." He laughed. "That was a very difficult morning. It was a terrible morning," she said. But even then I had this, she shook her head, pressing his hand. This absolute bedrock thing, which was, that man walked up to a stranger's trouble and gave away his finest horse without blinking. Whatever else happens, I know who he is, and that was enough. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at her in the starlight, feeling the warmth of her hand, the warmth of all of it, the land, the house, the sleeping children, the garden along the south fence, the carved wooden horse on the shelf, Cedar in the paddock. All of it gathered here around this one thing, this one morning in Dusk Creek when he had stepped off a boardwalk and walked into a life. "You know what I remember," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The way you stood," he said, "when Prout had your wrist. You were standing as straight as a woman has ever stood, and you were not crying and you were not begging, and your face," he paused. "I thought, whoever she is remarkable." And I hadn't even heard her speak yet. Clara was quiet. The stars were fully out now, the great wash of them across the desert sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek rustled in a small night wind. "We were strangers," she said. "We were," he said. "It's extraordinary," she said. "The precision of it, that you came into Dusk Creek on that particular morning, that you were at the Copper Spur, that you came outside." "I heard your voice," he said. "That was what did it. Before I had any idea what was happening, I heard your voice and I got up from my stool." She looked at him. "Just my voice. It was the way you sounded," he said, frightened and absolutely refusing to let it show. I had never heard anything like it. She said nothing for a moment, just held his hand in the dark, and then she said very quietly, "I am glad you heard it." "So am I," he said. "Clara." "Yes," she said. "I would do it again," he said. "Everything, every single morning of it." She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. "That's the thing about you, Elias Calloway, you always would." From inside the house there came the sound of James stirring in his sleep, making the small, exploratory sounds that children make when they are deciding whether to wake properly or settle back. And then the sounds quieted, and the house was still again, and the land lay around them in the warm dark, 40 acres of their own ground, paid for and hard-earned and deeply loved. Mathilda, from her paddock, delivered her opinion of the night, which was as decisive as all her other opinions. "Good night, Mathilda," Clara said in a conversational tone. Elias laughed, and Clara laughed, and they sat there in their chairs on the south porch under the stars with the herb garden sending up its nighttime smell of rosemary and lavender. And it was late November of 1882 in the New Mexico Territory, 4 years from the morning in Dusk Creek that had started everything, and they were in the middle of their one good life, which they had built out of a single act of plain-hearted generosity and everything that came after it. In the years that followed, the Calloway land grew as good land does under careful hands. James learned to ride Cedar, and was, his father noted with private pride, a natural, easy in the saddle from his very first lessons on the mild-tempered gelding. Ellen grew into her evaluating expression and added to it a curiosity and directness that made her teacher, when she was old enough for the school that had opened 15 miles north, call her the most formidable student she had encountered in 12 years of teaching. Clara said this was a mixed compliment. Elias thought it was the finest thing a teacher had ever said. Aldous Webb came for supper twice a year until he was too old to make the drive, and then his son came instead, a pleasant young man who had heard the story of the Dusk Creek morning from his father in considerable detail, and who looked at Elias and Clara with the faint, warm awe that people sometimes have for things they have only heard about in the way of legend. Elias paid off the land in full in the spring of 1885. He rode to Las Cruces on a fine horse. Not Cedar now, Cedar had retired to pleasant pasture, but a bay mare named Pearl with strong legs and a good heart, and he sat across the desk from Aldous Webb's son, and he signed the final papers and received the deed. And he came home in the late afternoon with the deed in his coat pocket, and he gave it to Clara without ceremony, just put it in her hands, and she read it with that focused expression, and when she looked up her eyes were very bright. "Ours," she said. "Ours," he said. She held the deed for a long moment, and then she folded it carefully and went to put it in the tin box on the shelf beside the carved wooden horse, and she closed the lid, and she turned around and looked at him across the kitchen, and she said, "My mother was right." "About the herb garden," he said. "About everything," she said. And then she crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back. And outside the south porch the lavender was blooming, and the mountains were turning gold in the afternoon light, and Mathilda, impossibly, still living, thoroughly unreasonable to the last, was making her views known from the paddock with all the authority of her considerable years. A 3rd child came in the summer of 1886, another boy. They named him Robert after nobody in particular, but because it was a solid name that suited him. And he was from the first a cheerful, uncomplicated soul who beamed at the world with his father's steady eyes and reached for everything with his mother's purposeful hands. James, at 7, received the carved wooden horse from the shelf as a formal gift, which he had been requesting for 2 years, and he received it with a gravity that acknowledged its importance. His father sat beside him on the porch steps and told him the story of the horse it represented, the cream and copper Appaloosa, the Dust Creek morning, the wrist and the note and the street and the trade. James listened with the complete attention of a 7-year-old who understands that he is hearing something important. "Did you miss Ranger?" he asked when Elias finished. "Every day for a long time," Elias said honestly. "But you did it anyway," James said. "Yes," Elias said. James turned the carved horse in his hands. He thought about this with that deep, slow, childish seriousness that is really not so different from adult seriousness, just more visible. "Because it was right," he said. It was not entirely a question. "Yes," Elias said, "because it was right." James nodded as though filing this away. He held the carved horse against his chest and looked out at the land, the 40 acres of good grass, the fence lined straight and sound, the cottonwoods along the creek, the mountains rising to the east in their ancient, permanent way, and he said, "I love this place." "So do I," Elias said, and he did. He loved it with the specific, unglamorous, bone-deep love that comes from having worked for something, and built it carefully over time with the person who matters most to you. Love that is not separate from the daily work of it, but woven through every fence post and garden row and early morning and late night, and child's voice from the back room, an oil lamp on the kitchen table and smell of rosemary in the evening air. He loved it the way you love the life that is actually yours, not the life you imagined or the life you planned, but the one that came to you through the particular accident of a morning, when you got up from a saloon stool and walked outside because a stranger's voice pulled at something in you, and you walked into a street in the red dust of Dust Creek, New Mexico territory in the summer of 1878, and you said, "Let go of her wrist," and everything followed from that. Clara came out onto the porch as the sun was going down, Robert on her hip, and she sat beside Elias on the top step, and James leaned against his father with the carved wooden horse still in his hands. And Ellen came bursting through the door a moment later with something urgent to report about a lizard she had found under the rosemary. And Elias caught her as she came past and tucked her under one arm, and she protested and then stopped protesting. And Clara was laughing. And Robert reached for the carved horse with one determined hand, and the mountains went from gold to rose to the first blue of evening, and the lavender along the south fence was heavy with late summer bloom, and Mathilda, faithful and impossible and eternal in her own opinion, made one final, comprehensive statement to the coming night, and it was good. It was all completely, utterly, permanently good. The morning in Dust Creek had been the beginning of everything, and the evening on the porch was everything it had become, and Clara had never forgotten the morning, and Elias had never stopped being glad he had walked outside, and the land was theirs, and the children were theirs, and the life was theirs, built out of a single clear choice made without hesitation in the red dirt of a town they had both long since left behind. That was the whole of it, and it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.